Hey everybody, Scott Marsh here with another episode of All Things Music. Today I'm really excited to have Dr. Heather Malyuk. And so she is an audiologist. And I'll just tell you a little bit about her and then we'll kind of get into what we're going to be talking about. So Heather got her bachelor's in music history and literature from University of Akron. And then she got her doctorate in audiology from Kent State University. She was the former clinical director at Sensophonics Hearing Conservation in Chicago, and she's now the proud owner of Soundcheck Audiology, which is a mobile concierge wellness practice here in Northeast Ohio. So we're very happy to have her on. Her clients include the National Symphony Orchestra, and without doing too much name dropping, we'll just say a lot of other world famous touring artists. Okay. So you can check her website out at soundcheckaudiology.com, and then her contact info is on there as well. So today, first of all, thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So we're going to be talking about hearing protection, how to just, what you need to be doing as a musician to protect and take care of your ears, just like you would any other muscle in your body, or like an athlete would take care of their muscles. It's, I think, a lot more important than folks tend to give it credit, unfortunately, and it can cause problems. And so Heather's going to give us some really great information to grab onto here to really help us out. So with that being said, we prepared some questions here, some topics, and we're going to start there. So first and foremost, why is it important for musicians to get regular checkups, hearing checkups?
I think it's important because many musicians forget that their ears are their first and most important instrument. And,
Sure.
I would say, imagine you are a trombone player. It should be easy for you. Imagine you're given a trombone as a kid and you're told, this is the only instrument you'll have. You'll never have another one. By the way, it's invisible. You can't see when it's hurt. And when it's hurt, it can't be repaired. Okay? What would you do for the rest of your career? Hopefully you would be having someone who can see that trombone check it every year.
Sure.
To let you know if it needs repaired or if it needs helped in any way or if you should be playing differently. It's the same with your ears, to do a check at least annually, or if you're someone who tours, maybe pre and post tour, I think is a good idea. But to have your ears checked every year is really checking on your instrument. There's sort of a misconception, particularly within the music community, that you will lose your hearing anyway. And so that for some reason it doesn't matter. But it does. Hearing loss does not have to be from aging, even though there are factors with aging.
Sure.
It's typically from things like sound exposure or issues with blood flow, genetics, viruses, things like that.
Right. And when you say sound exposure, you're not just talking about, when I think of exposure and how we talk about it, we're not just talking about one instance. It's over time.
Correct. It's cumulative.
Right. And also the time, which we'll talk about, in which it happens, right? So meaning like the immediate time, is it 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours?
Correct.
So,
yeah, depending on volume level.
Right. Okay. Perfect. So, and this may be a little on the easier side, and some people may already understand this, but explain how louder sounds, like we just talked about, especially over time, really affect your hearing. Sure.
There are a few different ways to think about it. There are certainly mechanical effects in the ear from loud sound. There's also reactive oxygen species in the ear, and essentially it's an oxidation process that happens from sound exposure. And when I say cumulative, we talk about sound sort of in a dosage, and people can overdose on sound. And what happens is when the system is overloaded, the cells in your inner ear are injured. And once they are injured, they don't regenerate. And that happens not just from the volume, but your length of exposure.
Right.
So if you can be, in a loud sound for a few minutes and it might not hurt you, once you tag on, depending on the volume, again, perhaps more than a half hour or several hours, it gets to be a lot. And then when we talk about the music community, which of course is my focus, it's not just someone going to a concert once a year. It's people who are exposed every day, sometimes all day, particularly music educators. Some newer research is finding that they're at the highest risk for losing their high frequencies of hearing. And it seems to be correlated to how many hours a day they are exposed.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. So that all makes a lot of sense, obviously, right? So it's you just, like with anything, right? You have to give your ears a break, and you have to make sure you protect them while you're using them.
Correct.
So, so what are some disorders, hearing disorders, that musicians usually fall prey to? Are there certain ones, or?
Yep, they're actually under a category called music-induced hearing disorders. MIHD is the acronym. And they can be tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, and it's not always ringing. Sometimes that can be buzzing or chirping in the ears, or different sounds. There's also distortion of sound. Perhaps you hear a certain frequency or a certain volume level, and it sounds sort of like a broken speaker. Okay. There's something called diplacusis, which is essentially a detuned pitch perception issue. So perhaps someone would hear one pitch and they would perceive it as being two pitches. Or perhaps someone would have what the lay term would be frequency smearing, where they hear a pitch and they can't tell, the difference between two pitches. So, for example, I had a patient not long ago who came to me and said, something's wrong, I can't tune my instrument anymore. I don't hear the difference between the strings.
Right.
So, that's another thing that could happen. One of the more prevalent disorders that I see is something called hyperacusis, or sensitivity to sound. So it's sort of the opposite of what you would think. You would think when you lose your hearing or when you have an injury that you would be weaker against sound, and therefore you could tolerate louder sounds. But it's the opposite. When you have an injury or you have a hearing loss, you're actually more sensitive to loud sound. It doesn't mean it's hurting you more. It just means you're feeling hurt more. And that is called hyperacusis. So like the ceiling goes down on your tolerance.
Right.
Those are the main disorders: tinnitus, distortion, diplacusis, or also frequency smearing, and then hyperacusis.
Okay. So, and this is something that, so when I first met Heather, which was not too long ago, about a year ago or so.
Yep.
And I got my earplugs, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And she was telling me this stuff. I was really floored, right? I was like, obviously I know, so there's scientific and medical terminology that are going to go along with this because it's part of your body, and I'm sure there's all kinds of study, but I was just kind of really blown away with all the different factors that are involved. I guess I never really sat down and thought about it, as I think a lot of musicians do, right? Like she mentioned, it's an instrument. I can imagine not being able to tune my instrument.
Yeah.
Because right then, you're done, right? You're pretty much done from that point on. So, let alone any other discomfort or any other sensitivity. Just those things are just very scary to me. So I'm glad I found her when I did, because I use my earplugs in a lot of different settings, and it's been a savior for me. So.
Yeah, and I find clinically that just hearing loss in and of itself is not necessarily the career ender for a musician. I see many musicians who have hearing loss, and they can sort of ear train to it in a way, even though they'd rather not do that, and they're still able to play. It is those disorders that end the careers. Yeah. And that really hurt people. And sometimes they can come from severe hearing loss, or sometimes I can see someone who seemingly has normal hearing on a hearing test and they're still struggling with something. Right.
Yeah. No, that's very true. Yeah, it sounds, again, this is why I had her on, because it's so important to get this word out, and to really, and not just her, but if you're a musician, if you're a fellow musician, or if you're a band director, or if you have kids, you really need to pay attention to this kind of thing.
Yeah, just to sort of say to the listeners, if we had more time, hours, we could cover ear anatomy and every little cause of hearing loss and everything else. I would suggest to you, look up ear anatomy online and learn the parts of your ear, just like the parts of your instrument. I think it's really important. Certainly, you can use my website as a resource. We mentioned Sensophonics. I used to direct the clinic there. There's a lot of great education on their website. But I really think it's important to know the parts of your ear, know what they're called, know how they work, and know how that instrument works, and be your own advocate. You might go to an audiologist and they might, put you in a booth and test your hearing, but they might not know how to talk to you as a musician. And you guys really do have to be your own advocate for your hearing.
Yeah, that's great advice. So give us some examples. I know this may be tough, but give us some examples of decibel levels for certain instruments or things like that, just so we can kind of understand more of the seriousness and understand really how loud these things can be.
Sure. to kind of start the conversation on that, we when we think of sound exposure, of course we think of the volume. Mm-hmm. Okay, because that's what we're aware of, the volume. When we really know it's hearing loss from loud sound exposure is about the volume and the length of the exposure. I think one of the reasons that people sort of fall into the trap of talking about decibel levels is because we think of things like factory workers and people who are exposed to certain levels in that way where they can always be measured. Music is extremely dynamic. And so often when we talk about levels for music, it's not the steady state level. Sometimes we talk about something called a peak of sound, which is the loudest something would get. So for example, a drum kit with sticks, even if someone's not super heavy-handed, but playing fairly loudly, they can hit peaks of 138 dB. I've seen that measured in person. Now, that's not the average. Okay, so if someone says, a drum might reach 138 dB, it's not going to be that loud the whole time. Average for a drum kit might be around 100 dB. Okay. Now, if you're in a situation where you're playing a drum kit within a band and you have, say, a wedge monitor next to you, you're not necessarily listening to 100 dB because you'll need your wedge louder than that to be able to hear. So your levels are going up. Now, other instruments, we talk about orchestral instruments. Myself, I'm a fiddle player and I, played violin through college and studied that as I was young. Certain levels that have been taken at the ear canal of a violinist can be 98 dB to, 99 dB. Now that's, again, a peak level. Sure. The average might be lower. But you think about someone, say, a classical violinist in an orchestra, how many hours a day are they practicing? Right. And so then it really can become injuring very quickly. Right. Brass instruments have been measured upwards of 100 decibels. So that just kind of gives you an idea. But really it depends on the repertoire. Sure. It depends on the player. It depends on the instrument. There are a lot of factors. But those are just, a few numbers. There have been studies done and there have been measurements taken. One of the sort of luminaries of music audiology, Mead Killian, has done some level measures. And I actually recently did an interview with International Musician, the publication, and his chart was in that article. And it sort of gave some of those levels as well. But just to kind of say, those are some levels as examples, but keep in mind with music, it is so dynamic that you want to make sure you focus on the average and your length of exposure rather than the number. Right. Okay. Yeah. So knowing all that, and knowing that somebody somewhere has come up with a system of saying, here is now your checkpoints, right? So you talk about people working in factories, right? So of course OSHA is going to get involved, right? And they're going to say, here is what an acceptable level is for an acceptable amount of time. Correct. So talk about their recommendations in that regard. Sure, yeah. OSHA, Scott mentioned OSHA, they're the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And of course, they're sort of the regulating body in this country for protecting workers, for keeping them safe. OSHA is fairly lenient in terms of looking at injury from sound. And OSHA says at 90 dB, you can be in that level of sound for 8 hours. Okay. Every 5 dB you add to that level, OSHA says you would have your time. So you cut it in half. So where 90 was 8 hours, 95 would be 4 hours, 100 would be 2 hours, etc. And just as a side note, when I say dB, there are different ways to measure dB. Okay. And it's called weightings. Can be dBA, dBC, etc. We always measure in dBA for hearing. Okay. And the only reason for that is because that's how the research has been. And sure. There's, some people in the music community say, well, we should measure in dBc. It takes into account more bass frequency, but we don't need to have that conversation here. Right. But when you are measuring your sound, if you do so, measure in dBA solely because the safety scales are done in that measurement. Otherwise, you'll be off on your calculation. So that's how OSHA works. Now, OSHA only protects about 75% of the population. And so there are some people who are more susceptible to injury because of genetics or blood flow issues or what have you. And so they may or may not be protected by OSHA. OSHA is the easiest scale for a musician to follow because, and I know this as a musician, it's tough until you really ear train. And I'm sure you experienced this last year, ear training to your earplugs. Right. It's not easy off the bat. And so OSHA is kind of your best case scenario for sort of dipping your toe into hearing conservation. But yeah, about 75% of the population is protected by OSHA. And I have found through case studies and also from my mentors who have done case studies that it can be very protective for music. There currently is no scale for musicians.
Right. There's not a separate scale.
Yeah, we don't have anything yet. Hopefully in the future, but for now OSHA, and then I know you want to bring up the other scale as well. Yeah. There's a more there's a stricter scale called NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and it protects 92% of people. Okay, so a lot more protected. It starts at 85 dB for 8 hours.
So instead of 90?
Instead of 90, it's 85. And then what you call your exchange rate is different. So with OSHA, the exchange rate was 5 dB. Right. That you would cut your time in half. With NIOSH, it's every 3 dB. And so, so, you know, without doing all the math, where OSHA said you had 2 hours at 100 dB, imagine sitting at an acoustic drum kit, NIOSH would say you have 15 minutes. Okay. So it's it's pretty different, but it's
considerably different, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
But it's great to know that the OSHA isn't necessarily the be all to end all, right? So here are some guidelines, and they are proven to be to be helpful. But there are other organizations out there that are taking a step further and maybe doing a little more study and saying, listen, really, to protect more people, we should have a better scale, right?
Yes, so. and even in Europe, the scales are even stricter. And so that's sort of what we have going on in our country in terms of what I would talk about with someone during an appointment. Right. I would say, just sort of as a caveat, we could talk about these scales all day. Sure. But it's not a replacement for an annual hearing test. Right. Because how do you know which scale is best for you unless you get your hearing checked to make sure that it's working for you?
No, that's a great point. So I mean, know the information, and if you need to test or find out what what you're doing. But as a musician, I mean anybody, but especially a musician, because music is dynamic, as we said. Yeah. It's so hard to test that. So let's just get it checked out and make sure that we're and clear. Of course, we know the music world is so varied. You could be a professor at a university who's always in the same room, or you could be in a touring band and you're in a different room every night. And so it is. Yes, exactly. Your levels can change quite a bit. Yeah, that makes. I mean, just as musicians, we always, our tuning changes because of weather, or, how we hear others on stage, depending on where we are set up, changes. And so if that's all changing, then you have to know that,
your levels are going to change.
Your levels are changing all the time. So yeah, that's great. So knowing all this, right, what are some kind of warning signs or symptoms that we can kind of watch out for if that are showing, hey, you might be having some issues? Yeah. Right?
I think sort of the main one that comes to mind that I often hear people say, oh, this is why I came in initially, is tinnitus. The ringing in the ears. People saying, I had, a really loud gig last night. My ears started ringing and it never went away. That kind of thing. Okay. The reason I want to bring that up first is because it's not always a sign. Okay. So I have seen plenty of people who have sort of the classic hearing loss from sound exposure. And they never had an ear issue in their life. They never had their ears ring, never had any sensitivity, anything. Sure. And so the answer for this question is interesting because if you're someone who's never experienced an issue, it doesn't mean you don't have hearing loss. Often people will get ringing in their ears after an exposure to sound. Some people get fatigued, and that's sort of a whole body thing. But I know definitely as musicians, if we have a long day of practicing, you can kind of feel that fatigue. Sometimes that comes with ringing, sometimes it doesn't. Something else would be that sensitivity that I mentioned. Suddenly you're more sensitive to loud sound where you didn't used to be. Also, difficulty hearing speech and background noise, even though that's not a music related thing.
Right, something to check. So if you're just explain that a little more.
If you're going out after your gig, and you're out at a restaurant or something and you feel like, man, I'm having a harder time understanding people than I used to. A lot of speech sounds are in the area of frequencies where we get lost from sound exposure. Okay. And so that could be an indication that perhaps you're losing some of that frequency resolution. Right. Okay. Yeah.
So if you're talking to somebody across the table and there's a lot of background noise and you're having a hard time hearing them, then that could be an issue.
Yeah, it could be that you're not as fine-tuned
Right.
as you used to be.
And I will definitely say that after seeing my hearing chart and knowing that I didn't really have a whole lot of issues as far as like sensitivity, I was starting to feel like, man, it's getting a little bit there towards the end when I first came to see you. So, you know, I didn't have ringing in my ears. I didn't have a lot of that stuff. But then seeing the chart and seeing where I was losing my hearing was shocking. You know, it was kind of like, wow, like, you know, I knew that there would probably be some there, you know, but I didn't think it was going to be so drastic. Even though it wasn't so drastic that I need a hearing aid, but in my mind, it was drastic to me.
Right.
It was like, you know,
and isn't it interesting
kind of a wake-up call.
as young musicians that we didn't learn about our ears? You know, things that could have been prevented. I was really lucky when I was a teenager, and then actually I got to study with him through my college years. A local violinist, Corey Smith, was my violin teacher for, 8 years. And he was really great about teaching me about my hands, about warming up my hands. And he taught me all the muscles and the joints and how to, like, you know, play in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. Hearing never came up.
Yeah.
Simply because musicians are not educated about it in order to teach their students. You know, it's not something that even comes to mind. And so an example of someone going to see an audiologist and saying, oh, I have more injury than I thought, that is something that likely could have been 100% prevented.
Right.
You know, and so if you're someone who's listening and you're saying, well, I don't have any issues yet, don't wait to get one.
Right. So
you know, the whole thing is the wellness, the preventative side of things, so that you know, don't wait till you have a sign of hearing loss. Make sure that never happens, so you don't ever have to deal with it.
Right. And it's not like you're going to get, you know, you're not going to a cardiologist or you know, some other specialist who is going to charge you $1,000 just to walk in the door. Right. So this is it's not that it's, you know, I'm just saying it's affordable and it's easy and it's quick and it makes total sense to take care of your ears, especially for what we're doing. Exactly. So let's talk about now. So there are ways, obviously, to then you have a lot of exposure because of what you do. Mm-hmm. So now we're going to, you know, I'll use the word prescribe, you know, a certain remedy, and that, you know, there are two in particular that you know, we talk about a lot. So filtered earplugs being one of them, and then in-ear monitors for folks. So if you can kind of talk about those individually and explain kind of what they are and how they work.
Yeah. So a filtered earplug is something that is typically made custom for an individual. And by that it means, you know, it's made just for that person, custom to their ear canal. Most people have tried foam earplugs. Okay. And so if you think of what a foam earplug sounds like, a lot of the high frequencies or high pitches are taken out of the sound, and it leaves everything sounding pretty muffled. Okay. Not only that, but when you have a foam earplug in correctly, it's often more protection than you need. Or I should say more attenuation, which is dampening of sound, than you need. When you are protecting your ears, once you're in the safe zone, you're safe. You can plug yourself up more. It doesn't necessarily make you safer. Okay? So something like a custom earplug, number one, allows you to sort of choose your level of attenuation. You know, when you and I sat down, I said, okay, let's look at what kind of filter you need for your type of exposure. Okay? For your length, for your volume, that sort of thing. With the filtered earplugs, they also give you what's called a flat frequency response. So the frequency response is sort of that balance of lows and highs, sort of your mix, if you want to think about it that way. And so where the foam took out a lot of the high end, a lot of the treble, the filtered earplugs give that back to you. I will say, as a musician, I remember being fit for the first time with filtered earplugs before I really knew what audiology even was, and I didn't like them. And it was because of how they had been described to me by an audiologist. And this is one of the reasons why you want to see a music audiologist, so they kind of know how to talk to you to set you up for your best case scenario. And I had been told filtered earplugs sound the same as the open ear, just softer. But they don't. And I think you could attest to that as well. They don't. They're your best case scenario, and they sound really, really good. But it still takes a week or two to ear train.
Yeah, it definitely takes time. I would say that just on that point, so everything else that you're hearing is besides you playing. So everything else, people talking, people playing around me, that sounded most like what it normally sounds like without the plug. The hardest part to adjust is hearing yourself play.
Right.
And so that took some adjustment. In particular, just, really, you can hear yourself well, but it sounds different. And I think the hardest part was to learn what volume level am I playing at. Right. For me, at least, it was hard to tell how loud am I playing now that I have these points. Should I back off? Should I play So learning your own dynamic range and where you're at to make sure that you're in accordance with everybody you're playing with was the hardest part for me. And funny enough, I had a tendency to play softer than. I thought I was playing louder than I was. Because I was asking people, am I really just wailing right now? Am I just, killing it? And they're like, no, man. As a matter of fact, you can play a little bit louder. I'm like, really? So, that took some time. The intonation, for me, because I know a lot of musicians talk about, but I'm worried about intonation, right?
Right.
Because you'll see, there's an old... thing where some people will you'll see instrumentalists do this sometimes. They'll put their finger in one ear, close one ear off, to try I want to hear the sound of my head and in tune, but you're actually closing off. You're actually tuning yourself flat.
So you bring up an interesting point.
So, but on those, I didn't feel that way. But it took me a second to kind of figure it out. But really, that wasn't an issue. Mine was just volume.
Yeah.
But talk about intonation.
Well, there are a couple things are interesting there, which is number one, from the moment you start learning music, whether you learn from age 2 or from age 20, people think about learning music in sort of a natural way. But really, you're learning according to a tube in the side of your head called your ear canal, which has a very specific frequency response.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so if you train for 20 years to something like this, and then you put something else in it and say after 2 hours, this is, I can't do it. This is all wrong.
Right.
It is an adjustment.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else. So number one. Number two is what those filters in the earplugs are dependent on are the air mass in the earplug. So stick with me for a second. There's a special device that's used to test the mass of air in an earplug. It's called a mass meter. Okay. And what it does is it takes that air mass and translates it into a voltage reading. And they have to meet a certain spec. And that's going to be dependent on the audiologist partially and also the manufacturer of the earplug. For particular musicians, so say like a brass player, you might need your earplug deeper in your ear than say a string player. Okay, and so again, I'm mentioning this because of why you should see a music audiologist as a musician. Right. Someone who would know how to take a proper ear impression, what to have you do while you're getting your ear impression done, and then also where to send that ear impression to have it made, the best that it can be made. Right. I think those things are really important for the sound quality. And I wouldn't be able to say this, but having worn earplugs on different stages, having played with them, having used different types, it is so dependent on how they fit you and how they're made.
Yeah.
That sound quality issue. Now, the other issue you brought up was about, sort of regulating yourself, hearing yourself. That's where in-ear monitors, one area where in-ear monitors can really come in handy. Okay, number one. For anyone out there who's using a wedge monitor, they could use in-ear monitors. Okay, so all it is the wedge monitor, but at your ear level. There are a couple of things, just kind of basic main points about in-ears. One of which is they are not safety devices. Okay. There's sort of a misconception within the music community that just wearing in-ear monitors makes you safe. That is not true. It's how they fit you, how they're made, and how you use them. Okay. Then you can be safe. Okay, so there was actually a study done at Vanderbilt College in Nashville where they took 15 different artists and took measurements from their wedges and then also in-ear monitors and compared them. The study was done by Jeremy Fetterman, and it's a good study for anybody who wants to look it up. What they found was the artists were at the same exact decibel level, whether it was their wedge or their in-ear monitor. Even though an artist might think, hey, I'm being safe, I have my in-ears in, if they were 110 dB on the wedge, they were 110 in their ear canals. Okay. Right. The interesting part of the study was the second half, where they were asked to decrease the volume on their wedge monitors the average that they could decrease was about 1.8 dB, which was not very much.
Yeah.
With the in-ear monitors, when they were asked to do that, the average was 6 dB. And some people went as high as, or as low as 12 dB down, which is great. So that's kind of my first point about in-ears. To get to that point where you can use them safely,
right.
you must wear both. Okay, so you see a lot of artists, a lot of famous, singers and concerts on TV, whatever, and they pull one out. Okay, your ears do this really magical phenomenon called binaural summation. Binaural means 2 ears, and then summing of 2 ears, summation.
Sure.
And so when you're listening to a mix through 2 ears, your brain perceives it as being 6 dB louder than it actually is. It's magic. As soon as you pull one in-ear monitor out, you have to increase the ear that's listening by about 6 dB. Wow. To be able to hear clearly. So, okay, let's think back to our OSHA and NIOSH scales. Mm-hmm. Okay, if your stage is at 104 dB and you crank up your one in-ear monitor to, say, 106 so that you can hear over that, suddenly you're down to seconds, minutes of safety before you injure yourself. And then imagine a whole tour. And then imagine a whole decade of tours or even, performances. You don't even have to be touring. Performances with a wedge or an in-ear monitor.
Right, yeah.
Suddenly you're in a world of hurt. Okay, or you can be.
Absolutely.
So that's my other point is keep both in so that you have control over your volume. The other point with in-ears, I think that what I would say for local musicians is that you don't have to be a big touring artist to use them. Okay. I find a lot when I sit down with musicians, they'll come to me for earplugs or a hearing test and they'll say, well, we thought about in-ears, but, that's for famous people. It's not at all. And in fact, there are very affordable in-ear monitors that can be made custom. Shure, for example, has a great line of universal fit in-ear monitors that a custom piece can be made to put on them. And those start at $99 for a pair. Okay. Yeah. Of course, you need a wireless pack to get your mix from the board. Right, but
still, it's
Yeah. So I think they're very accessible. They can certainly help with pitch perception. For people who are playing in different venues, they give you the same room in each venue to work with because suddenly you're not dealing with the individual acoustics of the different venues. You're dealing with just the acoustics that you're mixing in your ear canal. Okay. So I think they have a lot of good benefits. One of which, when you mentioned earlier, what made me think of this, when you mentioned earlier about regulating yourself. Mm-hmm. When you're able to work with an audio engineer or maybe control your own mix, you can EQ all of that in.
Right.
If you're having an issue with a certain frequency response and you say, man, that doesn't sound quite like me, you can make it sound like you, which is a really huge benefit. Yeah. What you want to look for in any in-ear monitor you get is isolation. And that's the reason for that is because that's how you're going to control the volume. So there are some in-ear monitors that are made out of, hard material, some that are made out of soft material. When you get something that's a soft material, it can fit deeper into your ear canal and it can block you more from your surroundings. Okay? That's the only way you won't have to compete with those surroundings for volume and you're able to turn your volume down. That being said, a lot of artists find it very disconcerting to be that blocked off. And so suddenly, you're looking at maybe a big room, but you feel totally separated from that room. And that can be odd. And it can feel weird. And that's why people will pull one out so they can hear the room again. Right. Within the past, decade, there have been ambient in-ear monitors created. Okay. Some have a hole drilled into them so that you can hear what's around you. I would suggest staying away from those because then you have no isolation and you cannot control your volume. Right. There are some that have, a hole drilled in and they have a filter on them. It's maybe a step up from that, but at that point, you're still dealing with an altered ambient frequency response. You still have that, filter frequency response. There are active ambient in-ear monitors made, and those are something that have a little microphone placed in the earpiece, and they sound the same as the open ear canal. And then what you do is you can actually turn the whole room down and hear it as if there's nothing in your ears, just softer, and then put your mix in. And that's sort of, your best case scenario if you're someone who can't deal with isolation, is that you get, sort of get yourself into the safe zone. And then the last thing I want to say about in-ears, because I know this is a long response, is the annual hearing test. Right. Whether you're using plugs or you're using in-ears, please get your hearing tested every year. Because again, that's the only way you're going to know if you're at a safe volume, if you're able to turn your volume down, and that if it's the right volume for you is to get it checked.
Right. Yeah. That's great. So a lot of information there. Some people will be hitting the rewind button and trying to, catch some of that. But, again, if you have any questions, and we'll say this again, please check out the website, and always just give her a call,
Yes, exactly.
All right. So by using plugs, filtered plugs or inner monitors or anything, can we stop or at least slow down hearing loss or disorders?
Yes, from sound. Disorders and injury from sound. That I don't want to be too broad in my response because there are certainly other things that can cause hearing loss.
Sure.
I mentioned earlier genetic predisposition or issues with blood flow.
Right.
Or, people who take heavy life-saving medications. Or sometimes people will get a virus in their ear, and perhaps they have some injury from that and it was nothing to do with music. Okay.
Right.
But yes, proper use of earplugs and in-ear monitors within musical settings or loud environments can certainly prevent the disorders, or if you're someone who already is dealing with ringing in your ears or hypersensitivity, hyperacusis, it can keep you stable. And that's, I work with that a lot with musicians is just saying, how can we keep you stable and keep you from getting worse so that you can work? As wonderful as it is to say, I love ears and I want to save your ears, I really want to save your careers. And I want to keep you working forever. And so the whole point is, how do we keep your career prolonged? Before we started taping, you and I were talking about national audiology organizations and sort of what they're doing for musicians to, not just musicians, but the audiology community. Mm-hmm. There is the American Academy of Audiology, AAA, and there's also the National Hearing Conservation Association. They're a wonderful resource. It's hearingconservation.org is their website. I'm on the executive council. I sit as a commercial member delegate. And they're creating a position statement on recreational sound exposure that includes music. And also AAA is creating a sort of best practices guidelines for audiologists on how to work with you guys. Because believe it or not, musicians are somewhat of a mystery to the audiology community. And it cracks me up in Northeast Ohio. I mean, where I got my doctorate at Kent State, the audiology clinic is in the music building.
Right.
They share a building. And I bet you none of the music students know that they're there.
Right.
I certainly never did growing up playing at, the Federation Festival there as a, kid. You walk right by the audiology clinic every time you go in the Kent Music Building. Right. And so there's this huge disconnect. In the doctoral program for audiology, music is not mentioned. It's just not one of those things. Some people they're starting to talk about iPod use, things like that, and recreational exposure going to concerts, but not how to work with musicians. And so what happens is a musician will go see an audiologist, and the audiologist will fit them with their best guess of what they might need. And so you're saying, will those help block disorders? It depends. Were you fit properly?
Right.
Were you taught properly? If you're a touring musician who perhaps was out at a venue and an audiologist came and took impressions on your ears and gave you some in-ear monitors or you ordered them, but you've had no education about how to use them, they will not help you at that point. They might hurt you. And so that's my way of saying it. I think there's hope for the future of those really protecting you guys as soon as everybody gets on board. Right. And learns how to do that.
Right. It's like they're originally and paying attention to just how sound affects, but not spending time on talking to or learning from or studying people who produce sound.
Right.
That, so we're sound producers.
You are, yes, that's exactly right.
So you're talking about, recreational listening at a concert, but you're not talking about what about people who are producing those sounds and how do they protect theirs, because it's going to be different.
It's totally different. It's every night and it's all day long for you guys. Right. The other thing to mention with sound exposure is you could be a musician who uses your in-ear monitors exactly right and uses your earplugs in rehearsals, but if you're going out on the weekends and racing cars without hearing protection and shooting guns and doing every other kind of loud exposure, don't expect your hearing to be stable. So, that's something else. It seems like common sense, but a lot of musicians get very focused on the gigs and the rehearsals, and they might forget about other aspects of their life. And so if you're going to care for yourself in every aspect.
Right. Yeah. And I'll say that I'm a criminal of that a little bit sometimes. And for me, it's weird. So when I am surrounded by musicians, right? So if there's musicians behind me in a group or on the sides, I'm definitely wearing my plugs, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting this to anybody, but for some reason with me, when musicians are kind of more in front of me and I'm in the back, I just, when I don't wear them, I don't feel nearly as much exposure, which is probably makes no sense, right? But for some reason, like, I feel like when it's more around me, it is more intense, right? And so I'm like instantly, so if I'm in a big band gig and there's trumpets behind me, I'm fast grabbing, or if I'm playing in a concert band and there's percussion behind me, they're in all the time. Yeah. Rehearsal or not. But if I'm playing in a group where I'm kind of in the back row, I just don't feel. I still use them sometimes, but I'll have more of a tendency to take them out from time to time.
Your exposure might be lower. I mean, if you're in the back of a brass section, everyone's bell is pointing away from you. Yeah. Your level might be lower. I mean, it would be hard to know without a reading, a measurement of the level, but I think that's also being sort of a good consumer of your sound. And you do have the education for me to know, okay, what does the level feel like? How long can I be here? You can get away with taking your plugs out once in a while if you need to. Right. For a solo or a certain piece, and then knowing when to put them back in and giving yourself a break. Right. So 100%. I think that you brought up an excellent point where it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing with earplugs. If you get earplugs and you think, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this 100% of the time, don't. Performance is key. And if you say, I have a solo coming up in this piece of music, and then I really have to hit it exactly right, play your solo. And then put your earplugs in after. Right. Yeah, and I think that's why I'm so into education and not just your earplugs or product, is because if you have them and you think it's an all or nothing thing, you will never wear them. They'll go in a drawer, and then it's a waste of money. Yeah. It's really about a balance and learning how to care for yourself. And I did that very thing. So when I first got them, I started using them right away, and they said, well, I'm just gonna see how it works, right? Because you're not gonna learn unless you use them. Mm-hmm. And if especially in a big band setting, I would be playing, and if I had I was gonna blow over some changes, I would pull at least one out, if not both. Mm-hmm. At first I was taking them both out so I could really hear the rhythm section and hear everything that's going on. And then it got to, okay, I just want to pop one out, whichever ear was closest to the rhythm section, and now I don't pop out. So, but only those situations where, a lot of individual practice, I don't wear them, or in those, moments where I'm kind of in the back and everybody's kind of pointing away from me, Yeah, and again, what's going to tell you if you're doing it right? An annual hearing. Right. A wellness appointment. That's really, because it's guesswork. And earlier when I made that analogy about an invisible trombone, that's what it is. And actually, truth be told, unless you're exposed to something like a really loud blast of sound, hearing loss is gradual. Yeah. And especially for musicians, my goodness, our brains are so flexible. It's called plasticity. And we can adjust so easily that I think especially musicians, now this is anecdotal, I don't have any science behind this, but adjusting to hearing loss until one of those disorders pops up can really happen. People think, oh gosh, hearing loss is the end of the world. You can adjust to all kinds of levels of hearing loss, which to me is very dangerous. Because if you're not someone who's getting your hearing tested and your brain is getting used to a certain hearing loss, and then you say, things don't sound as bright as they used to, or my ears are starting to ring, and then you think, oh my goodness, I wish I would have had my hearing tested 10 years ago. Is that, anyway, it happens very gradually. It is sort of that invisible instrument. And so doing the annual hearing test is really such a great way to say, okay, I guess when I pop them out and pop them back in, I think I've learned. I think I'm doing everything right. It's kind of like going to the dentist and hoping you don't have cavities. Right. That you've been brushing your teeth the right way or using, the right toothpaste or whatnot. Right. And that's so true. We as it's just humans, we adjust and adapt very quickly. Mm-hmm. And even, you hear things about, somebody, found out they had cancer and they got
days to live. Well, how did they not know, right? So because they have pain, but they adapt and they adjust to it, right?
Yeah.
And they just in over time, some people adapt differently and at different rates and can handle more things than others. And so because everybody's so different, it makes it difficult to know when to go in. But the point is that you just go in all the time, right? So go in when you're supposed to, and then hopefully Heather or somebody like her will help guide you to making sure that you're protected all the time.
Right.
And you mentioned something to me as we just kind of, the last thing we're just saying is just, final thoughts, whatever final thoughts we have. And one that popped in my head too is that, and I'm not discouraging going to get your hearing checked at all, but some musicians, you told me, before that, like, you'll have somebody who's like a hardcore rocker and they have like no hearing loss, and they have like, everybody adapts differently. And so there's no way to know if you're adjusting to a hearing loss or if you don't have a hearing loss.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. For whatever reason, I have seen people, I've seen hearing tests of people you would definitely know, touring artists, and they have this most gorgeous hearing. And I'm thinking to myself, good for them, But for every person who's like that, I see 70 who aren't.
So, right.
But to be that one person would be amazing. Right. And I'm not a research scientist or anything like that. I'm sure there are very specific sort of like metabolic reasons for that. Perhaps it comes down to diet or genetics, things like that, or probably a combination of all the above. Anyway, you're exactly right. Once in a blue moon, we get a set of really tough years. And it's really remarkable. And maybe one day we'll harness that and see like how everyone can be that way.
Just take this one little pill and you'll be good, right? So.
Yeah, but I think for the average musician, I typically recommend an annual visit. I mean, sometimes for touring bands, I'll say, after the tour, get a check. Just make sure everything's fine. Right. I think annually is plenty, especially because coming from a family of musicians and having worked as a musician myself, you don't always have the budget to just drop, whatever you need to, whenever you'd like to. And so I think annually is plenty. I'd say once a year, just go and sit down with an audiologist, hopefully a music audiologist, and talk and make sure everything's fine.
Yeah.
And you know what? The other thing is, and I'm sorry, I forgot to bring this up with the earplugs. As you do those annual tests, the other reason for them that I think you should have them, check the fit of your earplugs. There's this myth out there that your ears never stop growing. They do technically, but they adjust over time. You lose elasticity, you lose collagen, things that sort of keep them, up where they're supposed to be. And the ear canals can change over time, especially any weight gain or weight loss more than 10 or 15 pounds. And I think to get the fit checked every year to make sure they're working is so important, because if you're wearing your earplugs every day, but they're 6 or 7 years old and you've never had them checked and suddenly they're not really blocking you anymore, then what's the point? And then you go in and see the audiologist and say, I'm dealing with all this hearing loss now. Why? It's because you never had your earplugs checked. Yeah, and that
makes obviously total sense. It's like anything else, right? So just get it checked, and things are going to change, and make sure that it's all on the up and up. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, I just have another question here for you real quick that I just thought of. So, talking about, make sure, if at all possible, see a music audiologist, right? So my guess is that there's far fewer of you out there than non, than
That's
general
exactly
audiologists, right?
Yes.
So if you're watching this and you're in LA, which probably not, but if you are, right, or in New York or in Miami, is there a place to go to kind of find you all? Is there a website that lists, hey, here's where you can go, or where should somebody go to research to find the nearest music audiologist?
If you're someone who wants to see a music audiologist, please email me, because I know them.
Sure.
And so I can give you someone's number or someone's email address. My email address is heather@soundcheckaudiology.com. It's also my website. So you mentioned LA. Out there, you would see some audiologist named Lisa Tannenbaum. She's the best out there. My mentor in Chicago, Michael Santucci, he's an audiologist who is one of the fathers of music audiology. And he's, even that research study I mentioned from Vanderbilt, he was part of that, and a lot of people have learned from him. That's who you would see in Chicago. In New York, there are several audiologists. In Philadelphia, in Miami, there's a handful. Right. In the big cities, there's a handful. Sure. I'm here back in Northeast Ohio now, but I can certainly point you to someone.
Sure.
And even if you're in a location where I can't, you can always go see an audiologist and then talk to me.
Sure. Right.
I'm always happy to do that. If you say, I had a hearing test done, I couldn't go see a music audiologist. Would you mind taking a look and giving me, an idea of what you think about my hearing? I'm more than happy to do that.
Right. Yeah. That's something I was thinking about as we were talking about. I'm sure as we move forward, there's going to be more and more because there's more awareness of it. Mm-hmm. You're one of the people that's helping that move that forward. But just thought, well, what if you're not in Northeast Ohio?
Yeah, exactly. And I think
in
terms of there being more, it's certainly sort of not just a hip thing in audiology right now to do, but I think people really care. I know myself when I was in Chicago for 5 years, I had more than 40 students from local audiology programs that I taught how to, at least on a very low level, how to sit down with a musician and help them to the best of their ability. So I think you will see more of that sort of popping up around the country. That's one of the reasons why I've designed my practice the way I have. I don't have a brick and mortar. I have portable testing equipment that's been, FDA approved for being portable. Mm-hmm. And I go out to music venues and I go out to people's homes and sort of see them where they need to be seen, right, so that they don't have to come to me. I think one of the biggest hurdles for musicians is the wacky schedules. How many hours a musician works and they can't necessarily get in an appointment, and sort of just the convenience aspect of it.
Sure.
And so that's my way of saying it's, if you're someone who thinks you can't be seen by someone, we'll make it work. However we need to, whoever you need to see, whoever you need to talk to, we'll make it work.
Right. Great. So again, I just want to thank you so much for coming on today. It's something that we really need to pay attention to, musicians out there. So, just really take care of yourself, take care of your ears. So, like Heather said, so your career in music can continue to be prosperous for you. Mm-hmm. So it's really important. So thank you again for coming on.
Thank you.
It was so much fun, and very, there's just so much there to grab onto. Again, if you have any questions, please, again, we'll say it again, soundcheckaudiology.com. All our contact information is there, and some good information too that you can just read over there as well. So moving forward with all things music, the next couple episodes, and usually I know kind of which one is which, in what order they're going to come after this one, but I actually don't know because of scheduling, some things that we're trying to work out. But the next two will be, one is with Director of Bands at University of Akron, Galen Carricker, and he and I are going to be talking about kind of tips or thoughts and ideas for high school students who are embarking on taking college music auditions, right? So things that you can think about and things that you can do to prepare yourself for these music auditions that you're about to take to enter college music programs. And then the other one is going to be with retired Director of Bands from Kent State, Dr. Wayne Gorder, and this one I'm really excited about because it's kind of nerdy, and I'm a theory nerd a little bit, so I get excited about this thing. But we're going to be kind of directing this towards mostly high school band directors. There'll be plenty of information for both college and community and middle school band directors as well. But we're going to be talking about harmonic intonation, right? What it really is, how to do it, how to achieve it, how to teach it within your ensemble. So I'm super excited about that one too. So keep an eye out for those. As always, if you have any comments, on anything or on any topic that you'd like to see discussed, please just write that in. And or if you have somebody in mind that you'd like to see on the show, let me know and I'll see what I can do. And other than that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.